Dad, the voices of the two unfamiliar twins, who looked exactly like his daughter, made the single father's heart skip a beat. His rundown but peaceful world had just been officially torn apart. The afternoon heat over the suburban parking lot carried the heavy, unmistakable scent of unburned hydrocarbons and hot iron. Beneath the blinding glare of the sun, Ben Watson, 34 years old and broad enough across the shoulders that his frame cast a long shadow, stood over the engine bay of a client's 1969 Mustang, giving the vehicle a final tune-up before it rolled into its display spot for the classic car show. He was leaning in deep, adjusting the idle screws on the four-barrel carburetor with a slow, deliberate precision that seemed at odds with his massive hands. A few feet away, Wyatt Hayes leaned against the front fender, a 35-year-old man who lived his life at a perpetual simmer, shifting a wooden toothpick from one side of his mouth to the other. Wyatt nudged Ben's arm with an oil-stained elbow. "Look at that thing, Ben." Somebody dropped a small fortune to turn that Escalade into a rolling fortress. Wyatt pushed himself off the fender and wandered away toward the edge of the lot to light a cigarette, but Ben only shook his head with a quiet exhale, his eyes never leaving the brass fittings of the fuel line. He turned the screwdriver a quarter-inch, listening to the rough lope of the V8 engine smooth out into a steady, rhythmic thrum. He listened to engines the way other men listen to a heartbeat, waiting for the exact moment the mechanical struggle gave way to perfect harmony. 50 yards across the dusty street, the heavy doors of the armored Cadillac Escalade swung open. Imogen, a high-end nanny wearing a perfectly pressed suit, stepped out into the heat. She immediately wrinkled her nose at the smell of exhaust and old oil, pulling her phone from her purse to check the map of the classic car show with a look of profound annoyance. Behind her, two 10-year-old boys stepped down. Archer and Knox Powell wore pristine white linen shirts, perfectly pressed light blue linen shorts, and Italian suede loafers that had never seen a day of actual dirt. They radiated the kind of insulated, expensive cleanliness that made them look like stranded royalty in the middle of a working-class car show. But unlike Imogen, who looked at the surrounding muscle cars with absolute disdain, the twins looked at the rows of exposed engines with wide, captivated eyes. There was a current running beneath their pristine clothing, a wild, instinctual fascination with heavy machinery and raw horsepower, a genetic inheritance from a father they had never been allowed to know. Drawn by the deep guttural roar of the Mustang's exhaust, the two boys silently drifted away from their nanny, walking softly toward the red car where Ben was working. Parked parallel to the Mustang facing the opposite direction was a battered 1967 Chevy C10 parts truck. Sitting squarely on the edge of the truck's steel toolbox was Sadie. She was 8 years old, wearing faded denim overalls stained with gear oil at the knees, her legs swinging freely. Her short pixie cut framed a face dusted with light freckles, and she was entirely at peace in a world made of grease and loud noises. She had a perfect vantage point of the main aisle, and she was currently inflating a massive pink bubblegum bubble, watching the crowd with the idle curiosity of a child who had nowhere else she needed to be. The bubble snapped softly against her lips. Archer and Knox stopped walking. Both boys froze in the dust, their eyes snapping away from the Mustang's engine and locking onto the girl sitting on the toolbox. They stared at her, and Sadie stared back. It was as if someone had dropped a mirror into the middle of the parking lot. Beneath the expensive haircuts and the dirt-smudged cheeks, the three children shared the exact same brow, the exact same jawline, and the exact same piercing, observant eyes. Sadie stopped chewing her gum. She frowned at the two boys in their immaculate linen shirts who were staring at her without blinking. "What are you looking at?" she asked, tipping her chin up the way a person does when they are entirely accustomed to holding their ground. Her sharp, clear voice cut through the mechanical noise. Ben stopped turning the screwdriver. He wiped his hands quickly on a red shop rag, ducked out from under the hood of the Mustang, and stood up to his full height. He eclipsed the sun as he stepped forward, a giant of a man in a faded work shirt, his deep voice rumbling over the idle of the engine. "Everything all right here, Halfpint?" Ben asked, looking down at the two wealthy strangers standing in front of his daughter. Startled by the sudden shadow, Archer and Knox broke their stare from Sadie and tilted their heads back to look at the massive mechanic. But before their eyes could travel all the way up to his face, their gaze caught on a piece of metal reflecting the harsh afternoon sun. Beneath the faded, sweat-stained collar of Ben's shirt, hanging from a thick leather cord, was half of a silver emblem. It was a steel falcon wing, sheared cleanly down the middle, its beveled edges having been manually polished smooth. Ben's motion of standing up straight caused the cowhide leather cord around his neck to swing right into the center of the two children's upward gaze. The noise of the car lot seemed to drop away into a sudden vacuum. The twins possessed a terrifying, hyper-observant memory for mechanical parts. The shape of the broken silver wing triggered an instant, undeniable recognition. Ben stopped moving. He stood completely still, the shop rag hanging forgotten in his hand, looking down at two boys who wore the exact same face as the daughter sitting behind him. Archer's hand raised slightly, his finger trembling as he pointed at the center of Ben's chest. "Ford Falcon," the boy whispered, the words barely carrying over the engine noise. "Mom!" Knox stood beside his brother, his mouth slightly open, nodding in silent, paralyzed agreement. Before Ben could form a single word in response, the sharp sound of leather heels on asphalt broke the quiet. Imogen rushed forward, her face pale with horror. "Archer, Knox," she gasped, grabbing both boys by their hands and hauling them backward. She did not look at the children. Her eyes were locked entirely on Ben. She looked at him with a specific, rigid disgust, the way a person looks at a dangerous stray animal that has wandered too close to the dining table. She treated his silence not as shock but as a threat, pulling the heirs of the Powell Empire away from the oil-stained man who was holding a dirty rag. Imogen dragged the children back toward the Escalade, waving her hand frantically at the driver's seat. Callum, a bodyguard with biceps the size of bridge cables stretching the fabric of a black suit, instantly dropped the heavy vehicle into reverse. Imogen shoved the boys into the cool rear cabin and climbed in after them, quickly pulling the heavy armored door shut before the electronic latching system engaged to pull the door flush into its strike and lock it securely. Ben took a step forward, intending to ask a single question, but the heavy engine of the Cadillac surged. As the Escalade lurched backward and cut its wheels hard to the left, Ben's eyes dropped instinctively to the pavement. He did not look at the tinted windows. He looked at the mechanics of the machine. He saw the way the rear chassis sagged under the lateral G-force. He saw the uneven, shredded wear pattern on the inside edge of the left rear tire. His mind, trained by a lifetime of reading metal, instantly calculated the geometry of the failure. The left rear suspension tie rod was fatiguing. It was not a theory, it was a physical certainty. At highway speeds, the metal would shear entirely. Ben raised his hand, stepping into the driving lane, signaling for the vehicle to stop. Callum checked his side mirror. He saw a rugged, dusty man in faded denim with grease on his hands. Callum had spent his career evaluating threats based on wealth and status, and he decided in a fraction of a second that a street-level mechanic did not possess the authority to halt a $2 billion empire. He ignored the raised hand, shifted the transmission into drive, and buried the accelerator. The heavy Escalade tore out of the parking lot, leaving a cloud of hot dust in its wake. Ben lowered his hand slowly, watching the taillights disappear into the afternoon traffic, carrying away an unspoken burden. Two boys had just tilted his entire world off its axis. He stood in the settling dust, a quiet man holding a secret he had kept for 11 years. Ben turned back to his daughter. Wyatt strolled over, wiping his hands on the back of his pants, looking from the empty road to Ben's rigid posture. "You look like you just saw a ghost in broad daylight, man." Sadie slid down from the tailgate of the Chevy, landing on her 2 feet. She walked over to where Ben had been working earlier, bent down and picked up a small steel hex nut that had rolled off the bumper. She walked up to her father and held her hand out. Ben looked down at her. He took the small, heavy piece of steel from her fingers, closing his massive fist around it. He held it with a quiet, grounding pressure, the way a man holds onto the only piece of truth the world has left him. Inside the climate-controlled cabin of the armored Escalade, the air smelled of expensive leather and filtered conditioning, entirely sealed off from the dust and heat of the world outside. Archer and Knox sat in absolute silence. They did not speak of the towering mechanic with the grease on his hands, and they did not speak of the silver emblem resting against his collarbone. There was a specific, heavy secret vibrating between them, and they communicated it entirely through the microscopic shifts in posture that only twins truly understand, guarding the knowledge they had just uncovered the way men guard a map to a buried vault. The disappointment of being dragged away from the roaring engines evaporated, replaced entirely by the gravity of what they had found. Imogen held her phone to her ear, speaking in hushed, urgent tones to Ophelia Powell. The nanny amplified the danger of the encounter, painting the dusty parking lot as a hazard and the mechanic as an aggressive, unstable variable who had stared at the children for too long. In her office on the 42nd floor of the Powell Horizons Tower, Ophelia listened to the report, and the deep, enduring paranoia that governed her life tightened its grip. She ordered the vehicle brought straight back to the compound, retreating into the certainty of heavily guarded gates. Ben and Sadie returned to the shop at 7:00 p.m. Their living space was not a traditional apartment, but a retrofitted storage room at the back of the working garage, holding exactly what two people needed to survive, and absolutely nothing that required explanation. It contained one small bedroom for Sadie, where the walls were plastered with hand-drawn pictures of combustion engines. Ben slept on a narrow twin mattress pushed against the far wall of the main room, which served as both kitchen and living area. During the day, they covered his bed with a thick quilt patterned with interlocking gears and two solid orange throw pillows, instantly converting it into a sofa for the rare guest, maintaining a rigid, functional dignity over their cramped quarters. Sadie did not wait for her father to finish unloading the tools. She ran ahead to the side door and stopped, bending down to pick up a foil-wrapped basket resting on the concrete step. "Confetti pancakes," she murmured to herself. The basket had been left by Lorraine Foster, the 58-year-old owner of the fading diner across the street. Lorraine was a gruff, exhausted woman who allowed Ben to delay his rent during the slow months, acting as the warm, stable grandmother Sadie had never possessed. Ben had raised his daughter entirely alone since Adeline, her mother, walked out when Sadie was 3. He never spoke of the woman's absence, and Sadie never asked, both of them choosing to leave the space empty the way a person leaves a chair open for someone who is never coming back. That night, long after Sadie had gone to sleep, Ben sat at the kitchen counter and opened an old laptop that he had to keep constantly plugged in when using the name the nanny had shouted and the sharp, modern logo he had seen on the Escalade's tailgate. He began to search. It did not take long to find her. The screen loaded a high-resolution corporate portrait of Ophelia Powell, the fiercely private architect of a $2 billion armored vehicle empire. But Ben did not see the billionaire in the bespoke suit, and he did not see the cold, untouchable authority in her posture. He saw the terrified 23-year-old girl standing in the freezing rain beside a crumpled Ford Falcon 11 years ago. He saw Clara, the woman who had crashed into his life during a storm, stayed long enough to leave an imprint on his soul, and vanished before the morning sun hit the pavement. He stared at the screen until the battery warning flashed in the corner, the laptop acting up again. He knew he had to go to the tower. Not to demand recognition, and certainly not to claim a place in a life she had clearly built without considering him, but because the left rear suspension on that vehicle carrying 2 boys who shared his face was bearing a fatal flaw, and she needed to know before the metal finally snapped. At 2:00 p.m. the next day, Ben walked through the revolving glass doors of the Powell Horizons Tower. The lobby was a cathedral of brushed steel, seamless glass, and sound-dampening acoustic panels that swallowed the noise of the city. Ben stood in the center of it, wearing steel-toed boots, clean denim jeans, a rarely used button-down shirt, and a slightly faded driving jacket smelling faintly of solvent. He had tried to pick out his cleanest outfit, but it was still him, not trying to appear as anything other than his usual self. Yet he still looked like a heavy, foreign object introduced into a perfectly sterile environment. The receptionist stared at him for 3 full seconds before she remembered to ask for his name. He asked to see Ophelia Powell. A look of surprise and even a touch of annoyance was evident on the receptionist's face. Then she told him to go wait on a bench a few feet away. 5 minutes later, the polished doors of the executive elevator chimed and parted. The woman who stepped out was not Ophelia. It was Blythe, the executive assistant, walking with the brisk, calibrated efficiency of a woman whose time was measured in thousands of dollars per hour. Behind her walked Callum, the massive bodyguard in the black suit. Blythe stopped 10 feet away. She evaluated Ben's appearance, her eyes searching for the angle, the grift, the reason a street-level mechanic was asking for the CEO. Callum leaned down, whispering something into Blythe's ear. Blythe's expression hardened into professional ice. She turned on her heel, walked back toward the elevator, and pressed the up button. Ben recognized the architecture of the rejection instantly. He knew they had assessed him by the dust on his boots and found him unworthy of an audience. As Callum stepped forward, Crossing his arms to form a physical barricade of dark wool and muscle, Ben did not attempt to push past him. He understood that Ophelia was not coming down. But the physics of a failing tie rod did not care about corporate hierarchy, and the lives of those two boys were currently riding on compromised steel. Ben raised his voice just enough to carry over the bodyguard's shoulder and cut through the pristine silence of the lobby. Check the left rear suspension tie rod on the armored Escalade. The lateral stress on a sharp turn is fatiguing the metal. It is going to shear. Ben's voice was deep but resonant, aimed at Blythe, who had already stepped inside the elevator. Blythe paused. Her finger hovered near the control panel. She looked back out at him, her brow furrowing slightly, registering the extreme clinical specificity of the warning, just before the heavy steel doors slid completely shut. Callum escorted Ben all the way out to the visitor parking garage, walking exactly one half-step behind him, radiating the kind of coiled tension that invited a physical altercation. Ben gave him nothing. He kept his hands loose at his sides, his jaw set, refusing to speak a single word to the man trying to intimidate him. He opened the door to his battered Chevy truck, settled into the driver's seat, and started the engine. Callum stood outside, his eyes never leaving him until his truck drove out of the gate. Ben reached into the inner breast pocket of his driving jacket. He pulled out a thick white envelope. He had intended to give it to her today, to leave the ball in her court, to let her decide how to handle the sudden collision of their past and present. He placed the envelope into the glove box and closed it with a sharp click. He would wait for her to answer the warning. Ben spent the rest of the afternoon changing the oil in Mr. Harris's car and cleaning the shelving area, Wyatt's chore, but the guy had a reason to take the afternoon off to go on a date with a jade-eyed girl he'd just met. The fading afternoon sun stretched through the open bay doors of the garage, catching the suspended dust in long hazy ribbons. Ben was finishing the floors, dragging a heavy cotton mop across concrete heavily scarred by dropped wrenches and decades of spilled oil. The water in the industrial yellow bucket had already turned a dark, metallic gray. He worked with a steady, rhythmic motion, pushing the dirt toward the exterior drain, letting the physical labor clear the remaining adrenaline from his encounter at the corporate tower. Then Blythe walked into the shop. She offered a polite greeting, and Ben paused for a beat. He hadn't expected to see anyone from Ophelia's side this soon. A small flutter of joy danced in his heart. But then he froze as his eyes caught sight of the two men and one woman behind Blythe wearing immaculate, dark wool suits, their polished leather shoes stepping carefully over the oil stains. They definitely didn't look like they were there for afternoon tea. Ben leaned the wooden handle of the mop against the wall. He wiped his hands on a clean rag and waited, his massive frame perfectly still. The lead attorney, a man in an exquisitely tailored gray suit, unclasped a leather briefcase and withdrew a 50-page document. He set it onto the scarred metal of Ben's workbench with a hollow, authoritative thud. Beside the thick stack of paper, he placed a wire transfer agreement drafted for the sum of $3 million. Mr. Watson, the attorney said, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. This is a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. It acknowledges that Ophelia Powell retains sole legal and physical custody of Archer and Knox Powell. It dictates that you voluntarily waive any right to interfere in their education, medical care, or residence, and that you commit to maintaining a physical distance of no less than 500 feet from the children, their mother, and any property owned by Powell Horizons. In exchange for your signature and your perpetual silence regarding the events of 11 years ago, the funds on that check will be yours. Ben looked at the check. He looked at the 50 pages of legal text designed to erase him from the lives of the two boys. He could now confirm with 100% certainty that Archer and Knox were his sons, even though he might have believed it before. The kids had his face, Sadie's face. They were family. The brief, foolish hope that Ophelia might have sent Blythe to open a dialogue vanished as quickly as the sun dipping behind the buildings across the street. He breathed out a long, heavy exhale of resignation, not bowing to power but from the disappointment that the sweet woman from 11 years ago had merely seen him as a passing fling. "Wait here," Ben said. He turned his back to the 4 corporate delegates and walked out into the fading light of the parking lot. He opened the door of his 1967 Chevy truck, reached into the glove box, and retrieved the white envelope he had placed there hours earlier. He closed the door, walked back into the garage, and stopped directly in front of Blythe. He held the envelope out to the executive assistant. Give this to her. I don't want her money and I don't need a payout to leave her alone. If she doesn't want me interfering with the life she built, I won't interfere. Take the check and go." Blythe took the envelope, her fingers brushing the thick paper. She looked from the unopened seal to the mechanic's face, her brow furrowing slightly, registering a profound disconnect between the profile of the opportunistic grifter she had been briefed on and the quiet, dignified man standing in front of her. "You should take the money, Mr. Watson," she said, her voice softening with a strange, hesitant empathy. "It would secure a very comfortable future for your daughter." Ben shook his head with a slow, definitive finality. It was then that the female attorney stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete. She did not possess Blythe's hesitation. She looked at Ben with the predatory calculation of someone who understood exactly where to place the knife. "You misunderstand the nature of this visit," the woman said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "If you ever attempt to disrupt Miss Powell's life in the future, we will not simply drown you in endless litigation until you are bankrupt from legal fees. We will purchase the debt of the diner across the street and foreclose on the elderly woman who runs it, which includes this very workshop. Your rent will triple. We stand here believing that you would rather keep a secret about two boys who aren't yours than risk losing the daughter who is, or bringing ruin to the well-meaning woman who shelters you." The silence that followed was absolute. Ben's jaw locked, the muscles in his forearms coiled, his hands curling slowly into heavy fists at his sides. The threat was not an exaggeration, it was a certainty. They possessed enough capital to destroy his world in an afternoon, and they had aimed all of that destructive power directly at Sadie, at their peaceful life, and at his only friends. He looked at the female attorney, his eyes carrying a dark, heavy weight, acknowledging the brutal efficiency of the tactic. He could not fight a $2 billion empire, and he would not gamble his daughter's safety to try. He picked up the pen from the workbench, turned to the final page of the document, and signed his name in sharp, aggressive strokes. The attorneys collected the paperwork and walked back toward the navigator, waiting for them outside. Blythe lingered for a fraction of a second. She watched Ben turn away, his broad shoulders slumped slightly under the weight of an invisible, crushing load, walking back toward the yellow bucket to resume mopping a floor that was already clean. She slid the white envelope into her folio, climbed into the back of the SUV, and closed the door. As the vehicle merged onto the highway, Blythe pulled her phone from her pocket. The image of the mechanic shouting his highly specific warning as the elevator doors closed refused to leave her mind. She dialed Callum's secure line. "Take the boys' Escalade down to the company shop," Blythe ordered, her voice tight. "Have the engineering team run a full diagnostic on the left rear suspension tie rod. I want it on a lift tonight." Callum sighed heavily through the speaker. "It's a good vehicle, Blythe. You're letting that grease-stained maniac dictate our security protocols because he wants attention." "I do not care what he wants," Blythe said, cutting him off with a sharp, absolute authority. "It is the vehicle that carries the heirs of this company. Put it on a lift, and until the engineering team clears it, pull a different car from the fleet." Callum muttered a begrudging acknowledgement, and the line went dead. 20 miles away, inside the executive suite of the Powell Horizons Tower, Ophelia sat alone in the quiet hum of the climate-controlled air. She had not gone home in 2 days. She sat at her massive oak desk, her eyes fixed on a secondary monitor displaying the live security feeds of her estate. She watched the grainy black-and-white images of Archer and Knox sitting in the library, drawing in their sketchpads. She was hiding from them, paralyzed by the certainty that her highly intelligent sons had recognized the mechanic, and entirely unsure of how to look them in the eye and continue the lie. She could not let them know the truth. The father they idealized in their imaginations had to remain a mystery, because the alternative, a man who lived in a dusty garage with oil under his fingernails, would shatter the pristine legacy she was trying to build for them. The heavy door to the office clicked open. Blythe stepped inside, carrying the leather folio. She did not speak immediately. She crossed the wide expanse of the carpet and placed the thick, white envelope directly in the center of Ophelia's desk. "He signed the agreement," Blythe said quietly. "He refused the money. He asked me to give this to you, and he promised he would not bother you or the boys again." Ophelia stared at the envelope. In the bottom left corner, pressed lightly into the white paper, was the faint, unmistakable smudge of a thumbprint rendered in motor oil. It carried the scent of a storm from 11 years ago, a physical artifact from a past she had spent a decade trying to outrun. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a sudden terrifying spike of adrenaline. She nodded once, dismissing her assistant without looking up. "Thank you, Blythe. Go home." When the door clicked shut, Ophelia picked up the envelope. She held it for a long moment, tracing the edge of the paper, feeling the weight of whatever truth the mechanic had chosen to send her, but the fear of what it might contain, a demand, a confession, a claim on the children she guarded so fiercely, was stronger than her curiosity. She opened the top drawer of her desk, dropped the sealed envelope inside, and turned the silver key until it locked with a heavy, definitive click. The executive boardroom on the 42nd floor of the Powell Horizons Tower was designed to project absolute control, featuring seamless acoustic glass and a 20-foot mahogany table that currently held exactly 0 answers. At noon on Thursday, the air in the room was thick with a specific, highly compensated panic. 6 department heads and 4 senior engineers sat in rigid ergonomic chairs looking at the digital projection on the far wall the way a ship's crew looks at a catastrophic breach in the hull. Standing at the head of the table was the lead chassis engineer, 58 years old, who had spent his entire morning staring at physical evidence that contradicted his computer simulations. The diagnostic team put the Escalade on the lift at 8 in the morning, exactly as Blythe requested, the engineer said, his voice stripped of its usual confidence. He tapped a button on his remote, and the screen magnified a highly detailed ultrasonic scan of a steel suspension component. The left rear tie rod is spiderwebbed with microfractures. The lateral stress from the ballistic armor package during high-speed cornering is causing acute metal fatigue. It is not a theoretical vulnerability. It is a physical certainty. If that vehicle had been driven on the highway for another 50 miles, the steel would have sheared entirely. Ophelia sat at the opposite end of the table, her hands resting flat against the polished wood. She did not look at the veteran engineer, and she did not look at the millions of dollars worth of corporate talent failing to solve the problem. She looked only at the fractured line of gray pixels on the screen. "How many?" Ophelia asked, her voice quiet and carrying a cold, heavy edge. 20, the head of sales answered immediately, reading from a tablet. "We have 20 custom vehicles with this exact chassis configuration currently deployed. They are being driven by foreign dignitaries, corporate executives, and private families." The silence that followed was absolute. Ophelia waited for the engineering team to present the solution, for the highly credentialed experts to provide the fix that would allow her to repair the vehicles and bury the error. But the lead engineer simply shook his head, looking down at his hands the way a man looks at a broken tool he does not know how to repair. The software models could predict the fatigue perfectly, but every solution the computer generated triggered a fatal cascading failure. If they thickened the tie rod, it interfered with the ballistic underbelly armor. If they altered the mounting geometry, it destroyed the center of gravity, guaranteeing the 3-ton armored vehicle would roll during a high-speed evasive maneuver. The modern engineers weren't blind to the problem. They were simply trapped by the strict physical constraints of the chassis, unable to reinforce the steel without requiring a complete, multi-million-dollar redesign. Ophelia closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She understood the mechanical reality of her position, and she understood the brutal, inescapable math of the alternative. Admitting a structural failure of this magnitude would shatter the reputation of the Powell brand, inviting a wave of canceled contracts and plummeting stock valuations. But attempting to hide it carried the risk of 20 fatal accidents, a gamble she would not take with the lives of her clients. "Draft the safety recall notice for the NETSA," Ophelia ordered, standing up from the table with a slow, deliberate motion. "Contact every client directly. Ground the vehicles immediately. Tell them our mobile teams are working on a fix, and do not end the call until you receive verbal confirmation that the keys have been pulled." The consequences arrived with terrifying speed. By 3, the financial news networks were running segments on the catastrophic engineering failure at Powell Horizons, and the company's stock ticker bled a deep, aggressive red across the bottom of the screens. The phones on the executive floor rang in a continuous, overlapping drone. Ophelia spent the next 4 hours absorbing the anger of elite clients and terrified board members, fielding the damage with a stoic, unyielding posture that cost her entirely. At 9 o'clock that evening, the heavy oak doors of Ophelia's home study opened. She was sitting in the low leather armchair by the window, her bespoke suit jacket discarded over the back of the sofa, looking out at the darkened grounds of the estate. She had not been home in 3 days, and the quiet of the house felt heavy, pressing down on her shoulders the way water pressure builds at the bottom of a deep pool. Archer and Knox walked into the room in their pajamas, carrying a small silver tray between them. "We made you dinner," Archer said softly, his voice carrying the careful, hesitant tone children use when they know an adult is hurting but do not know how to fix it. They set the tray onto the small table beside her chair. It held a small artisanal salad made with greens from the estate's private greenhouse, a carefully balanced vinaigrette crafted by their longtime chef, and a precise crumbling of goat cheese. It was a small, earnest attempt to offer comfort in a world they did not fully understand. Ophelia looked at the two boys, feeling the sharp, agonizing ache of a mother who had just spent her afternoon failing to protect the empire she was trying to build for them. She pulled them both into a fierce, silent embrace, burying her face against the soft cotton of their shirts, breathing in the clean scent of laundry soap and childhood. She sat back and picked up the fork, eating a small bite of the salad to honor their effort. Knox stood near the edge of the desk, looking down at his leather slippers. "We heard the security guards talking by the gate," the boy murmured. "They said the cars are broken." Ophelia stopped chewing. She set the fork down carefully. "It is a complicated engineering problem, sweetheart. The team at the office is working very hard to solve it." Knox fell silent, waiting for his mother to finish eating. Archer spoke in a guarded tone. "Mom, did you know? He's really good at fixing cars." Ophelia jolted, looking at her son, then quickly regained her composure. "Ah, well, the company has a lot of brilliant people, sweetie." Archer grew urgent. "No, I didn't mean that. I mean the man at the classic car show." The boy's gaze seemed to pin his mother down. Ophelia feigned turning away to pour a glass of water to avoid looking at the two boys. Archer continued, his voice rushing with earnest speed. "He knows how engines work, Mom. I bet he could fix our car." Ophelia looked at her son, and the deep, entrenched blindness of the elite world reasserted its grip. She looked at the innocence in the boy's face and felt a profound, exhausting sadness. It was a childish fantasy, the belief that a single dusty man in a suburban garage could understand the proprietary physics of ballistic steel and complex geometry. The MIT graduates, the veteran engineers in her tower, could not solve it, and they possessed the finest diagnostic technology money could buy. How could a grease-stained mechanic working on old muscle cars, possessing nothing but calloused hands and a shabby auto shop, possibly know this highly advanced engineering? "The cars we build are very different, Archer," Ophelia said quietly, offering the gentle, condescending lie of a parent closing down an impossible idea. "He wouldn't understand how to fix them." She coaxed the children to sleep. The executive break room possessed the kind of sterile, engineered quiet that was meant to foster absolute focus. But on Friday morning, it only amplified the sound of a company slowly bleeding to death. The engineering team had worked through the night, running thousands of automated simulations, and they had produced exactly nothing. Blythe was absent-mindedly gripping the handle of a white ceramic coffee mug, the company's black logo facing away from her. She had been standing hesitantly by the coffee counter for nearly 5 minutes, unable to remember what she had intended to do next. Add milk or add sugar? No, that wasn't it. Something had slipped her mind. "The man," she blurted out, ignoring the bewildered, exhausted stare of the sales director who was making coffee right beside her. "Are you talking to me?" he asked, his voice unsure. Blythe set the mug down on the counter and walked away very quickly, leaving the dumbfounded sales director behind, his sleep-deprived appearance looking utterly ashen. Blythe took a deep breath before knocking on Ophelia's office door, and she didn't even dare to breathe heavily after telling Ophelia what was on her mind. Ophelia was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city traffic. She did not turn around when the door opened. "The engineers cannot find the mathematical variable for the metal fatigue," Blythe said. Ophelia let out a long, exhausted breath. "I know, Blythe. I am drafting the press release for the board." "He did not touch the car, Ophelia," Blythe said, stepping further into the room. Ophelia finally turned, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Who?" "The mechanic." Blythe said, her voice carrying a quiet, unyielding force. "He was the one who spotted the flaw. He was the one who warned me when he came here looking for you the first time. He didn't even touch the vehicle, but he recognized its failure. Think about it. He must understand it." Ophelia looked at her assistant, the elite certainty that governed her life warring against the desperate reality of her collapsing company. "He is a man who changes oil in a suburban garage, Blythe. It is a childish fantasy to believe he holds the answer to a proprietary engineering failure." The silence in the office stretched out, heavy and absolute. Ophelia stared at the woman who had served as her most trusted advisor for years, recognizing the absolute conviction in Blythe's eyes. 10 minutes later, they were in the back of the Navigator, driving toward the suburbs. But when the SUV pulled up to the edge of the cracked asphalt lot, the massive corrugated steel bay doors of the garage were pulled down and secured with heavy brass padlocks. The shop was entirely closed. Blythe crossed the street to Lorraine's Blue Plate Diner to ask about the situation. The diner was aged and empty of customers. Lorraine was wiping down the counter with a stern expression. Blythe asked about Ben and was met with a rather displeased attitude when Lorraine realized she wasn't a customer looking to get a car fixed, but was just looking for Ben for some personal matter she wouldn't clearly disclose. Lorraine didn't like women hovering around Ben. After all, her impression of the wife who abandoned little Sadie to hit the road with some playboy made her believe Ben had terrible taste in women, and to prevent Ben and Sadie from getting hurt any further, it was best if he just stayed single. But Blythe had barely been taken aback by Lorraine's attitude for 10 seconds when a tall guy with long sun-bleached blonde hair, smelling of motor oil, sporting a radiant smile and chewing on a toothpick, eagerly stepped forward. He had been sitting at the bar the whole time. Wyatt enthusiastically invited Blythe to sit down and introduced himself as Ben's best friend. He informed her that Ben had taken Sadie fishing, which according to Wyatt was highly unusual, closing the shop abruptly on a weekday afternoon for the two of them to go on a picnic alone. It was as if Ben wanted to escape or erase something. Ever since he came back from that classic car show, he hadn't been normal, Wyatt muttered in conclusion. Blythe said goodbye to Wyatt with a promise to stop by the shop for tea sometime and returned to the car where Ophelia was waiting inside. Ophelia sat in the back of the Navigator, listening to her assistant relay the information, feeling a sudden, crushing weight settle into her chest. She had sent lawyers to threaten his daughter. She had built a wall of money and legal force to keep him entirely out of her world, and he had simply accepted it, walking away into the quiet of his own life, leaving her to the ruin of hers. Returning to the office, Ophelia tiredly looked over the negative reports that had been sent in. Her shoulders slumped under the pressure. Her throat was parched. Never before, since the day she took over the company following her father's death, had things been this difficult. She opened a side drawer, wanting to take out the photograph taken with her father, the picture beside the Ford Falcon that was her 18th birthday present from him. She had even personally designed some custom parts to make the car one of a kind, only for her to be the one who crashed it into a large tree, smashing it to pieces on that rainy, windy night 11 years ago. Her hand brushed against the edge of the picture frame as a natural reflex every time she opened the drawer. But her eyes stopped on the white envelope with the half-thumbprint of motor oil, the letter from the man from 11 years ago. Her heart gave a sharp pang. A wave of nervousness rose within her. She picked up the envelope, gazing at it. Unconsciously, she inhaled its scent, the smell of paper, the smell of motor oil, the warm, familiar scent from that stormy night. She opened the envelope, surprised to see a hand-drawn schematic and meticulous annotations regarding the armored vehicle's flaw, a technical failure that her team of experts still couldn't find an adequate solution for after 48 hours, let alone the months spent searching for options with the new design model. Now it was laid out by an ordinary mechanic, with a few words written at the bottom of the page. To Clara, tears rolled down Ophelia's cheeks. He still remembered. She was still Clara in his heart. But was he really just an ordinary mechanic like she had always thought? Why did he know these high-level engineering techniques? At the bottom of the page, beneath the final equation that would save her company from total collapse, were words written in a softer, slightly trembling script. To Clara. Ophelia pressed her hand against her mouth, a sudden, ragged sob breaking the quiet of the office. The tears spilled over her lashes, hot and entirely uncontained, dropping onto the pristine surface of her desk he had remembered. Across 11 years of silence, across the brutal divide of wealth and class, he had looked at the cold, untouchable billionaire who had just threatened to destroy his family, and he had seen the terrified girl in the rain. 10 minutes later, Ophelia laid the paper flat onto the massive mahogany table in the boardroom. The lead engineer looked at the hand-drawn schematic, his eyes tracking the math, tracing the forgotten limits of the steel. The color drained from his face as he realized the absolute humiliating truth of the solution. It took them less than an hour to design the physical brace based on Ben's drawing. It took them less than a month to deploy the mobile teams to weld the fix onto every vehicle in the field. The crisis was stopped, the stocks stabilized, and the clients were secured, all held together by the quiet grace of a man who was still diligently tending to his suburban auto shop and a peaceful life for his 8-year-old daughter, entirely unseen. It turned out that Ben's grandfather, Arthur Artie Watson, was the true soul of the early Powell mechanical shop. He was the one who had calculated the core load-bearing parameters of that chassis platform. The mistake made by Ophelia's modern engineering team was approaching it like a software algorithm. When the new ballistic armor added immense weight, the computers tried to solve the lateral stress by making the suspension increasingly rigid. But Ben, a man who grew up reading his grandfather's oil-smudged notebooks, knew that Arthur's original chassis design possessed a mechanical breathing room. The MIT engineers had treated this inherent flexibility as a variable to be locked down. Ben's hand-drawn schematic didn't try to fight the G-force with thicker steel. It introduced a dynamic geometric brace that allowed the suspension to safely flex and absorb the kinetic energy. It was a masterpiece of analog engineering, a piece of mechanical harmony that his grandfather had not had the time to optimize before he died. Ben Watson was the bloodline of the company's engineering. He was the institutional memory the corporate tower had forgotten, and he had given them the cure for absolutely nothing. The Powell family's luxurious leather photo album was open on the table, and Archer was enthusiastically presenting the photographs. "Here it is. This is Mom's old Ford Falcon." His voice rang with excitement. He looked up, a sly, mischievous gleam in his eyes. "Do you want to know a secret about me and Knox, Dad?" Ben offered a slow, amused nod, leaning in to listen. Taking that as his cue, Archer immediately dove into the tale. Archer rambled on for a solid 15 minutes, his retelling occasionally a bit jumbled as he eagerly tried to lay out all the clues for his dad. When the boy finally let out a massive, triumphant exhale at the end of his tale, Ben almost laughed. He pieced together that the whole ordeal had started on a night in June of last year. Knox couldn't sleep because Archer had pulled a foolish prank by sneaking the wig out of Mrs. Myers's bedroom. She was their elderly nanny who retired at the end of that month. Mrs. Myers was balding at the crown and frequently used various wigs to maintain a decent appearance. After her retirement, she was going to attend her niece's wedding, and she had invested in a very edgy hairpiece. Archer, being an energetic, mischievous 9-year-old, had accidentally spotted the new wig resting neatly on a plastic mannequin head when he went into her room looking for her. The boy believed that simply wearing it backward and draping a white bedsheet over himself would be enough to scare Knox into wetting his pants. And he was right. That night, Knox got out of bed and went looking for his mother. The house was quiet, but the door to her study was slightly ajar and the light was on. As Knox stepped up to the narrow gap, just wide enough for a child to peer through, he saw his mother kneeling on the floor, facing the bookshelf, crying. Their mother Ophelia, the powerful Miss Powell, was crying. Knox watched his mother place a silver piece of metal from her hand back into an old wooden box, then carefully tuck it deep inside the bookshelf before she replaced the heavy books in front of it, cleverly concealing the old box. Knox jolted backward when his mother turned to stand up. He crouched low, quietly crawled past the wall beside the doorway, and made his way back to his bedroom as silently as he could. Knox woke Archer up and told his brother everything. A week later, it took an elaborate, painstaking plan by the twins to find a window of time when their mother wasn't home, and they were left without a nanny constantly by their side. Luckily for them, Imogen was still in the phase of getting accustomed to the job before Mrs. Myers officially retired. Archer used their identical looks to his advantage to trick Imogen. Mrs. Myers was too absent-mindedly preoccupied with her plan to impress the single old men at her niece's upcoming wedding to pay much attention. Or perhaps she was simply used to their mischievous antics and didn't see it as a problem. As long as they were active and healthy, what little boy wasn't a bit naughty? That was her perspective. Imogen was entirely distracted, scrambling to fetch clean clothes for Archer, who kept deliberately dirtying himself. He first spilled strawberry juice, then somehow smeared a whole slice of frosted cake in a long streak from his shirt down to his pants. Later, he claimed a stomachache and dashed into the bathroom, only to sprint around to the garden, come back into the house, and declare himself to be Knox returning from catching bugs. While she was occupied with this chaos, Knox successfully snuck into his mother's study and inspected the item inside the box. With his intense passion for cars, Knox recognized it was half of a car emblem. Not only that, but it belonged to the very car in the photo taken on his mother's 18th birthday, her first car and birthday present. So when they saw the remaining half of the Falcon emblem around Ben's neck, the kids instantly knew. "Did we do a good job, Dad?" Archer blinked his eyes playfully. Beside him, Knox was a bit more sheepish but couldn't hide his pride at the brothers' cleverness. Ben and Sadie sat across from the twins. Sadie still wasn't used to having two older brothers who looked so identical, so she was much quieter than usual, just intently scooping spoonfuls of chocolate ice cream from her cup, occasionally looking up at her dad with a secret smile. Ben was vaguely watching the three children who shared his exact face, laughing and feeding each other ice cream, when the woman he once knew as Clara pushed open the door of Lorraine's blue plate and walked in. Ophelia's powerful presence now was a stark contrast to the 23-year-old girl running away from a politically arranged marriage all those years ago. Looking at her, he was instantly pulled back to that stormy night, the crumpled Ford Falcon, and the way a girl named Clara had crashed into his life only to vanish before morning. She stopped at the edge of the booth. First, she looked at Archer and Knox, who offered the slightly guilty, intensely proud smiles of boys who had just solved a puzzle the adults had failed to fix. Then she turned her attention to the 8-year-old girl sitting quietly beside Ben. From her leather tote bag, Ophelia carefully extracted a heavy, intricately machined metal model of a V8 engine. She set it gently onto the Formica table, right in front of Sadie. Archer's eyes widened and he nudged his brother. "That's the one from her home office," he whispered, a mix of awe and mild jealousy in his tone. "She never lets us play with it." Ophelia offered Sadie a warm, grounding smile. "I heard there's a brilliant young mechanic at this table. I thought this might belong in your hands now." Sadie's eyes lit up. She reached out to trace the tiny, perfect steel cylinders, then looked up, offering the formidable CEO a bright, genuine smile. Only then did Ophelia lift her gaze to Ben. She saw the dust on his canvas jacket, the grease stained deeply into the lines of his palms, and the silver falcon wing resting against his collarbone. "Hello, Ben," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor but remaining entirely steady. He offered a single, slow nod. Shifting his heavy ceramic mug to the side in a quiet, slightly hesitant gesture, he motioned toward the empty vinyl seat across from him, waiting for the woman who had run for 11 years to finally sit down. In a way, our lives are a lot like that heavy armored Escalade speeding down the highway. When the pressure of work, family, or society hits us, our natural instinct is to tense up and become rigid, just like how the computers programmed that suspension. So here is a question for you. When life takes a sharp, dangerous turn, are you forcing yourself to stay rigid and risking your own mental fatigue? Or have you given yourself a breathing room, a way to flex, absorb the shock, and overcome it? Let us know in the comments. What is your breathing room? Is it a small hobby like Ben working on his cars? A friend who's always there to listen? Or maybe it's the courage to face your past, just like Ophelia stepping into that diner,